prophetic, the mantle, brings a word from the heart of God and talks about what's on God's heart. And in this time we're in, I want you to listen to something the Lord is wanting to be heard today. King David was the greatest leader Israel ever had. Not because of his military prowess, but because he was a man after God's own heart. David loved people as a shepherd. He would throw himself between the danger and them, even from the time he killed Goliath. In today's world, there's an ever-present danger lurking, worse than a lion, worse than a bear. It is equivalent to Goliath. This giant we face today has come to destroy and enslave God's people. Only God's people, you may ask? This giant knows if he can enslave God's people, the world's people are no factor at all. In the time of the prophets, a real search is going forth to locate Jesse's 8th son. I speak prophetically of pastors. Pastors who have already killed the lion and the bear. Pastors who have real food to carry to God's armies. Pastors who recognize the fear in God's army. Pastors who have, at the bidding of their Father, brought food to the camp. Pastors who will tell the king, don't let anyone's heart fail them for fear. I will fight this giant. The deep state elites. The deep state elites machine. Pastors who will go in the power of the Lord, not in the power of swords and spears and shields. Pastors who have used their shepherd's tools well. Those pastors. It is these pastors that will in this 11th hour take the giant down and cut his head off. In a world where they threaten people if they speak, David's will make all the difference. In Lexington and Concord, it was a pastor and his flock that stood against British regulars. Where are pastors that will stand? And where pastors will stand, people will stand with them. Where pastors show courage, courage is spread to the congregation. There's nothing the deep state, the globalist, the regime of the seed of the serpent fears more than revival. We must have pastors in this time. We must have Davids in this time. Samuels are calling, but above all, the Lord is calling. Will you answer? In the time of the prophets, really was spotlighted in 2020. They began to be spotlighted when elections were stolen, lives were shattered, people were blinded with blindfolds, muzzles were placed on their mouth, and they were told the silliest things like you have to stand 6 feet apart. And in a time when people were locked in their homes, away from everyone, only seeing what was shown to them, so that when they walked back out, the way the room had been rearranged could not be noticed and could not be detected. In that time, prophets were raised up. Prophets that were always here, but suddenly the spotlight shifted to prophets. And the prophets took their bony fingers and they pointed it into the face of rogue kings and said, "Thus saith the Lord, this will be." And thus saith the Lord. Trump never went away. Why? Because the prophetic anointing held him. And it held the time and wouldn't let it go. In that time, people stood. And the people could never be blamed for what happened in 2020. The people voted. They did their job. They stood. They lined up for miles. They did their job. And when what happened, prophets had to walk up and stand in the place and hold the position. And we entered a time of two kings. We entered the time of Saul and David, when there were two kings in Israel at the same time. We entered a time in this nation where there were two presidents. The one, Saul, who lost his mind. And the one, David, who had the kingdom but no throne. And the one who lost his mind chased David around and round and round and round. But it was prophets. It was Samuel that carried the oil in his horn and anointed Jesse's son. And it began the time of two kings. The day came, so the Lord told me this in those days. And I realize a lot of enemies are watching. And I realize people who are being pushed by the devil, but I've only talked about something bigger than flesh. It's bigger than what you see. It's the seed of the serpent. And he's closer now of pushing his way in than he's ever been. But nay, not on this watch. And so the Lord told me in 2020, he said, this is not between me and the people. They did their job. He told me that. I'll never forget it. He said they did their job. Now Moses stands at the Red Sea by himself. And he said, this is between me and my prophets, whether they will stand on what they prophesied and hold what I said would be. So we began to stand. And this staff, I can't speak for other prophets, but this staff has been in D.C. This staff has laid on the concrete in front of the Supreme Court building. This staff walked up and down between the scrolls of the unborn and saw the whole thing reversed. This staff, with another prophet who had the miraculous dream, Timothy Dixon, called me up. I didn't know Timothy all that well then. And he called me up. And he had had a dream that they had rolled a scroll out in front of the Supreme Court building. And he said, I saw you and I go into this room where the Lord was. And he said, you had the scroll under your arm. And he said, we walked in and you could see the Lord back in there, but you couldn't make it out. And he said, what do you want? And he said, you said, I want my country back. And his hand came forth out of the room and said, granted. He said they rolled a scroll out in front of this giant scroll. Said when you rolled it, it just rolled out and it just started rolling out. And he said it wasn't signed with ink. It was signed with tears. And then a foundation suddenly calls him up and says, we're going to go before the Supreme Court building. And we're going to pray for this abortion thing to end. We're going to do this thing. They said, we have this giant scroll we're going to roll out. Now, they know nothing of the dream. And so he called me and he said, would you go with me? I said, yes. So the Lord had him and I walk down the middle. The scroll was so long, they had to cut it in half and make it 2 scrolls. So we walked between them. A witch showed up and walked the perimeter and had one of her henchmen try to attack me or someone with her. An abortion mob began to show up. And the Lord had us walk down and he gave me a voice to stand behind the podium. And I'll never forget how that speech started. It was a prophetic word from the Lord. I had this staff in my hand. And he said, if the world was a womb, and in it was decided who would live and who would die, and you had no voice, wouldn't you want someone to speak for you? And so the whole thing happened, all prophetically. And then suddenly, as that prophecy ended, I said, I want my country back. And I'll never forget looking at Brother Timothy standing behind me. And I said, the Lord said, granted. And then all the alphabet soup, CNN, ABC, MSNBC, all of them was over here. Well, if I was standing here, they were to my left, of course. And they were in a cage. They were just in a cage over there. And they just stared like this. I'll never forget it. And I guess this wild, long-haired guy with a long black coat, they didn't know what to do. And Brother Timothy's the opposite. He's just sharp as a tack, man. Bold as a lion. And he said, come on and let's walk down the middle of the Red Sea. Let's walk down the middle of those scrolls. And we went down the middle and went over to the cage and laid down on our faces, calling out to God. One in the cage, one picked up their camera and kind of did this. And went back. But Roe v. Wade ended after that. It ended. Prophets were standing. We were still standing. We were standing. We were prophesying and being, and attacks coming from everywhere, organized. I'm talking about organized, almost movie epic plays playing out, attacks. But we stood. And I'll never forget it. First Family wanted to have a prayer gathering before the Iowa caucuses started. I didn't know what I was going to do. Shanda, I had no clue. I thought, well, I can pray. And they had all these people lined up on the prayer. And I said, well, I don't know. I can pray. I said, sure, Lord, I can pray. The first family wants prophets on the call. I will be there. So we closed the church off here on that night. Nothing was happening. I'm back here in my office. And the Lord said, I said, Lord, what do you want me to do? And he started talking about the time of these two kings. And then I said, he showed me where Samuel had the oil. Remember Samuel, the Lord said, fill your horn with oil and go anoint David's son, Jesse. Or Jesse, David's father, David, Jesse's son. But Samuel didn't know who it was. He just knew it was one of Jesse's sons. So he said, you go to Jesse's house, fill your horn with oil. So, and Samuel said, but Lord, Saul will kill me if he finds out that I'm going to anoint another king. He wasn't afraid of dying. He was concerned that if he killed him before he could pour the oil, David would never be king, or whoever he was going to anoint. And the Lord said, the prophet has the oil for the king. See, the prophet always carries the oil for the king. Not a pastor, not an evangelist, the prophet. So I'm back here, my office, and the Lord, it was my time coming up. Prophet Amanda Grace was hosting the program. And I said, what do you want me to do? Up till 30 minutes before I was to come out. He said, fill your horn with oil. Because Trump was anointed for 2 terms. Another prophet anointed him for 2 terms. And he was president the whole time, whether you know it or not. In heaven's eyes, the man was still the president. If you think I'm kidding you, 25,000 people 5 times a day show up to hear him speak. Something went wrong in the nation, they went to him. They wanted to know what he thinks. But the Lord said his term will soon run out. He needs to be anointed again. So he said, fill your horn with oil. Well, I started getting a little bit like this now. I knew what he wanted me to do. So I looked around and got my horn. That's what this belt is for. My horn hangs on it when I carry it. And he said, fill your horn with oil. Well, I reached over to get this certain oil. And he said, no, get that oil. I reached over and picked it up, and it was oil on the front of it, Timothy V. Dixon. He said, fill your horn with that oil. So I poured that oil in there. And Prophet Amanda Grace was hosting the programs. Now there's 3 prophets about to do something. Not just one, there was more involved. So I walked out right here, standing right here with this podium this way. And I told the story of the 2 kings and poured the oil. The next day, the Iowa caucuses started, and Trump rolled over everybody, just started steamrolling over them. Came to July 7th. Wasn't it the 7th? I did the next one. They called me again. Amanda called again and said, they want to do another. Would you? Because it was coming up on that sentencing thing. Well, you see how that's went, right? Oh, come on, y'all. See, this is stuff behind the scenes you may not know, but I'm telling you, spiritually, I deal in the spirit. I'm not, you know, brother, we ought to just listen to God and do what He says do, and He's responsible for the results. So you think, wonder what has this got to do with them? Well, I'm about to tell you. So I'm standing out on the stage, and I wouldn't tell this for a long time. I didn't tell anybody until lately. But the time's crucial now. And so I said, what do you want me to do on this one? Well, Robin and I were scheduled to go and speak and teach on a cruise. I'm not the cruising type. You know, I go to Hawaii and I wear my coat and boots and jeans, and I'm just not, I do what I do. And so I was going to do it because that was an honorable thing to do, what I was going to do. But the Lord said, no, don't do this. So Robin said, I'll go do it for you. I'll go do it instead. I said, okay. No, don't. The Lord don't want this done. Then our little granddaughter said, sitting in the back seat of a car, she don't know anything about it. She's 9. She says, there's trouble in those waters. Tell Grammy and Pawpaw don't go. And a hurricane hit. Well, you start to get this clue. And I wonder, well, this is maybe why I don't feel like I should do it. Then they called and wanted us to do another prayer call on the day we ship out. I said, I won't abandon him. I can't go. I won't abandon him. So I said, Lord, again, what do you want me to do? What do you want me to do? I can pray. You want me to do that? He said, no. And he gave me these words, and he said, charge him as the king. A prophetic charge as the king. Now, just in case you think this is so far out, go watch the movie Reagan and watch Pat Boone take a prophet to Reagan. And the prophet prophesies that he would be president. People didn't even know that happened. Prophets are sent to kings, even if you don't know they were there. Now, why would I tell you I even was there? Well, one reason, it was streamed to certain people, so it's not a secret. So the Lord said, charge him as the king. Well, that was on July 7th. That day, the report came in later that on that day, the FBI pinged that shooter's phone. That same day, Trump was being charged. That was the day he missed. He missed on the 13th because of that charge that day. And that charge, if you go back and hear it, you'll hear why he missed. Well, so now he's been anointed king, charged as king, president. That's our equivalent to king. The people did their job in 2020. Now the prophet stood. And I'll never forget it. I stood right here on this stage and I went, to myself, I thought, we stood, man. We stood through all this. We stood. And then the Lord began to talk to me. And I don't have the word in front of me, but it's been spoken over the air. The Lord said, this is what you have to tell the people now. And now the people's job is coming up again. And so he gave a word to the people, but then he started talking to pastors. And he said this to the pastors: you've already saddled the prophets for defeat if it goes the other direction. He said, you won't speak. The pastors said, you won't speak because you're afraid of losing the platforms I gave you. And somebody very well known in the political circles was talking to me on the phone, and he said this. He said, pastors are like, they're worse than mafia bosses. He said, you can't get them to speak. And the Lord had already been he didn't know that. He didn't know what the Lord told me. But the Lord had already been talking to me about it. And he said, now, and in that word, he said, if it turns and goes the other direction this time, pastors, it's your fault. Not the prophets. We stood. He's back. Don't you understand? The deep state, the whatever you call them, the globalists, the one world regime, the seed of the stinking serpent. That seed of the serpent that's trying to bring the Antichrist in had to deal with three different world leaders. One was Vladimir Putin, one was Benjamin Netanyahu, and one was Donald Trump. And he had to get all three of them out of the way, because you can't be the Antichrist ruling over people with those three people in your way. And I don't like Putin. I don't give a rat's rear end of what you like. It don't make me any difference. The deal is that he wouldn't bow to a world dictator. Yeah, I know I said it. I know. Benjamin Netanyahu went away. They manipulated his votes, got him out of the way. But the day was, and I can't speak for other prophets. I can only speak for the one I know best. And I was standing over there in the old building on the 11th hour, and the Lord said, was it the 11th hour? Anyway, it was over there. And the Lord said, Israel desires their prophet again. Netanyahu, come on back. Come back, come back. He came back 5 times, unprecedented. Suddenly, he was back in office. They couldn't get rid of him. The Wagner group, they couldn't manipulate Putin's votes, so they tried to kill him. The Wagner group tried to kill him, don't you remember? Well, they couldn't, and he's still there. But then there was Trump. And the Lord said, call Trump and tell him to start his walk back to his chair. That's a campaign. And so we called him. We called for him. I'm not the only one calling. I'm just speaking for the only one I know. And so he started calling. And he started his campaign. And he said, I wasn't going to run. And suddenly he's running. Then the Lord anoints him, and then the Lord charges him. Now the Lord said, it's up to the pastors to speak. They won't speak. They just stand back and wait to see how it's going to happen. And then if it don't go the way they want it to, they can say, we didn't do anything. We didn't say anything. It was them prophets again. Them prophets you're talking about is the reason he's still here. So today, I read this that the Lord gave me. Samuels are searching for Davids. The Lord said they're looking for the 8th son of Jesse.